and welcome everybody to a webinar with a very long name. It's not only the federal government that can help save 1 billion birds from glass collisions. All of us can do something. It's an unusual conservation issue because you can personally take action as well as encouraging other action to be taken. One of the easy ways to do that is to help pass the Federal Bird Safe Buildings Act, and we'll talk about this a bit more at the end. But this is very important, and we'll be sending you a link so that you can sign on to our action alert. The Federal Bird Safe Buildings Act would require that the General Services Administration, that is in charge of all federal buildings, develop bird-friendly guidelines so that all new federal buildings and buildings that undergo significant renovation will use bird-friendly design principles and bird-friendly materials. That would be a tremendous example to set for the country and the world. So we're trying very hard to accomplish that. Why do we need to do this? Well, as many as 1 billion birds a year in North America die hitting buildings, hitting glass walls, hitting glass windows. These are birds that are important to us for a lot of reasons. Oh, here I am mixing my slides up again. I apologize, I forgot. What's a bird-friendly building? I like to actually show some pictures early on because this is what I think most people imagine when you say bird-friendly building. This is the emergency call center in the Bronx that replaced the one lost in the Twin Towers. And it's an attractive building, but it doesn't have much in the way of windows. It is a bird-friendly strategy to use less glass, but it's not the only strategy. So in this case, there's a lot of overlap between strategies for security and strategies to be bird-friendly. But here's an example of a very different kind of building, essentially a glass box that's been created in Mountain View, California, which is a town that requires bird-friendly design. So they used the glass with a narrow stripe here, which doesn't really block your view out. From the parking lot, you can't tell that the glass has a pattern on it. So it's just an ordinary building. There's nothing weird or unusual about bird-friendly buildings. This one actually is a little weird. This is a building in Houston that has a sunshade because Houston is a very hot place. The sunshade reduces energy consumption in the building, but it also acts to make the glass less visible to birds, and it has a security function as well. Here's a pretty standard looking building at the University of Vancouver. They've used a narrow vertical stripe in their glass to make it bird friendly, but you can see that plenty of light gets into the building and people can see out just fine. This is a building in Salt Lake City, Utah, the S.J. Quinney School of Law. They used a combination of bird-friendly glass called Ornolux, louvers on some windows, and insect screens on others. Insect screens are the unsung hero of bird-friendly design because they make your windows bird-friendly. They're very cost-effective. But these guys made 100% of the windows on their building bird-friendly without being asked or required to. And lastly, if you like shiny mirrored glass, you can use that in a bird-friendly building. Here, this pattern of stripes is always between the eye of the bird and the reflection, and that makes it bird-friendly. So some people ask, well, do we need birds? What is this all about? Why should we care if birds are being killed on buildings? Well, we definitely need birds. We just generally don't realize how much. Birds have intrinsic and cultural value, so they're very important to a lot of people just because they exist. But birds contribute hundreds of billions of dollars in eco-services. Birds are going to help plants come back to those habitats that are burning in California. Birds drop seeds, usually with a little bit of fertilizer to help it on its way. They bring seeds back into habitats where there are no plants. Birds consume enormous numbers of insects that might also eat your crops. They might destroy your forest. They might bite you and give you West Nile virus. So pest control is a very important function of birds that we just don't notice, even though they're doing it all the time. Birdwatching was a $40 billion industry. It's grown significantly since COVID because so many people have realized that they can watch birds through their windows from home. They're also noticing that, they thought they didn't have a bird collision problem, when in fact birds have been hitting their windows when they were out at work. So many jobs depend on bird watching, including travel, B&Bs, fancy equipment sales, trendy clothing sales. So birds are important in a lot of different ways, and it would be a serious loss if birds continue to decline. So what do we need to know? How do we attack this problem? What can we do? Collisions are not rare. Well, that must be obvious because there's a billion of them a year. But the fact is that almost everybody has seen or heard a bird hit a window. But most people think it's unusual. They don't realize how often this has to happen for everyone to have this experience. And, even children experience this fairly often. It adds up to that terrible number. Most collisions take place on glass that's installed up to about 100 feet. So homes account for almost 50% of those billion collisions a year. Every house is killing at least a couple. The other 50%, slightly more than 50%, are happening on lower stories of skyscrapers, but on almost all stories for low-rise buildings. Why? Birds are active in the zone of vegetation, which is from the grass up to the height of the trees. This is where they find food, where they find shelter, where they're most active. So this is like most car crashes happening within 20 miles of home because that's where you do all your driving. Collisions take place in the vegetated zone because that's where birds are most active and because that vegetation that they need is reflected in glass, and birds then mistakenly fly into those reflections and are injured or killed. The majority of birds that are killed on glass are songbirds, warblers, sparrows, thrushes, the ones you saw in that video loop if you signed in early. This doesn't mean that other kinds of birds don't collide with glass. Almost any kind of bird you can think of has been recorded at least once hitting a window. But these songbirds migrate twice a year. They fly from their breeding grounds in the north to wintering grounds in the south and back again. While they're doing this, they're flying through territory that they're completely unfamiliar with. They tend to migrate at night. It's safer because predators are not flying around trying to pick them off. They don't have to fly under the burning sun, but because they need to refuel. Migration is a lot like driving across country. You've got to stop every couple of hours to refuel. So birds need to make rest stops, and it may take them a couple of weeks to fly from one end of the country to the other. When they stop after having flown for some number of miles, they have to feed during the day. So that's when most collisions take place. Birds are flying around looking for food sources, and that's when they tend to run into windows. Now, there is something else that goes on at night. There's a lot of light pollution out there now, as we know, which have negative impacts for humans as well as for wildlife. Birds are attracted to light the way moths are. We don't really know the mechanism. It's probably an existing mechanism that's overwhelmed because the light that we shine at night is so much more intense than anything birds would normally expect. But what happens is that birds are sort of sucked into cities. This is where they're coming down at the end of their migratory stages. So ironically, if you look, you find more birds in the built-up areas than you do in the darker areas, which are vegetated and which you would want the birds to be in. And as they're flying around the built environment, they're colliding with glass. People collide with glass all the time. Every year, people are injured running into glass walls and doors, and I suspect that most people listening now have also at some point collided with glass. I know I have. We learn when we're young. We learn cues that tell us where to expect glass. We learn to understand glass as a transparent material that can also be reflective. Birds never have the chance to learn that, and they really are unable to learn the concept of glass as a transparent barrier. And if I take away the cues that you use, you can't tell me if this is a picture of a tree photographed through a window, or if it's a reflection of a tree in a piece of glass. Now, if I show you some right angles, which are not natural, these mullions, there's a crack in the glass, you know it's either clear or reflective glass, but you don't really know what it is until I show you this. Birds don't understand any of their cues, those cues. They take what they see literally. So for birds, the reflected habitat is just as valid a destination as the real habitat, and that is the cause of collisions. Now, it helps to understand this better to learn just a little bit about bird vision. This is not a biology class. We're primates. Our eyes are close together in a flat face. We don't have a schnoz sticking out between our eyes. So we see very similar things with each eye, and this gives us depth perception, three-dimensional vision. It also means that we tend to see the world as something in front of us, something that we're moving into. This is why people are always saying, watch where you're going. Birds, on the other hand, have eyes on the sides of their heads. Just try to imagine that you see almost totally different things with each eye. They have very little overlap of visual fields, which means they don't have a lot of 3D vision. They probably have enough to focus on what's at the end of their beak so they can decide whether or not it's worth eating. But they use other mechanisms to tell themselves how fast they're moving through a habitat. So they don't have good depth perception, but they do perceive the world as something they're immersed in. Their most accurate vision is out to the side. They can see well behind them. They're worried about predators. They're looking for food. If they're flying through what seems to be open sky, they're probably paying more attention to what's behind them than to what's in front of them. And again, this is another reason that we have collisions. To stop it, we have to draw birds' attention to what's in front of them. So my model of a bird flying through open sky is actually a kid texting on a skateboard, but I've never been fast enough to actually get that on video. But we can make do with this guy texting on a hoverboard. So he is in an open space. He doesn't think that there are going to be any obstacles here. And so he's taken his attention off where he's going so that he can look at his cell phone. And I have nightmares that someday I'm going to give this class and he'll be in the audience. But if we were to put a piece of glass here, he would run right into it because there wouldn't be any signal to tell him that there was a blockade. So our strategy is to come up with visual signals that will cause birds to change their flight, to fly around a building or above a building instead of trying to fly through a window. We can do this in a variety of ways. We can put patterns literally on windows. I mean, you could go out with a magic marker and put a pattern on your window and it would reduce the odds that a bird would hit it. The patterns need proper spacing, and that spacing relates to the body size of small birds. Birds are very good at understanding exactly how wide their wings are and what size space they can fly through. Through research as well as experience, we have found that a 2-inch horizontal gap like this will deter most collisions. It's really very good. You may have heard of the 2x4 rule. A 4-inch vertical gap will do a pretty good job. It will cut collisions substantially, but as we've discovered in the last 5-10 years, as we started applying these principles, a 4-inch gap won't stop hummingbirds, and probably not the smallest of the warblers. So if we want to do a really good job, we use a 2x2 guideline for spacing. The birds have to be able to see the patterns far enough away to change course. We don't have to use stripes and we don't have to use dots, and architects are becoming very creative in how they can design patterns that are safe for birds but are actually pleasing and interesting for people. Now, when I talk about 3D patterns, I'm thinking of things like insect screens again, but also louvers. Buildings sometimes have second skins that help control heat. There are a lot of different things that you can put on the outside surface of glass. But when we're talking about the patterns with the 2x2 spacing, they don't have to cover more than 7% of the glass surface to really work well. So this means that they don't have to stop people from having a view. They don't have to stop windows from bringing light into buildings. One of the things that we've learned in the last decade is that this is not sustainable design. We used to think, because one of the goals of sustainable design is to use natural light, that the natural consequence of that was these buildings that are made of solid glass. Well, it turns out that once you get above 20 to 40% of glass on a facade, you're starting to increase energy costs, and you can bring more than adequate illumination into a building with much less glass than that. So coupling bird-friendly design with other aspects of sustainable design is a good strategy, because many strategies for controlling light and reducing energy consumption are the same kinds of strategies that we use to create bird-friendly buildings. Another way to stop collisions is to educate architects. It's really important when you're trying to do bird-friendly design that you start at the very beginning of the project. That's when you can do the best design. That's when you can make it cost-effective. Everybody that works on this issue frequently gets emails from people who say, I saw this on the news, I saw this in the newspaper. There's going to be a big new glass building in habitat, where you would expect to find lots and lots of birds, in this case, along a river, in a lush habitat. How do I stop this building? When it's gotten to this point, it's almost invariably too late. People have fallen in love with the design that they've worked on. They've spent thousands of dollars on architects and on creating the plans necessary to construct a building. So getting changes made is difficult. They may have already ordered the glass. I'm not saying it's not worth trying, because if you can get in there early enough, sometimes you have a chance. But it's hard to know when a building like this is being designed. This is when we usually first hear about it. And it's also not possible for us to solve this problem one building at a time. I mean, here I'm going to give you an example of a fantastically successful story, which is not common. This is the Jacob Javits Convention Center. It's a big glass building. Something went wrong. They had to replace the glass much, much earlier than they ever expected they would have to. And the owner hired architects that were famous for doing sustainable design and said, this thing is just eating energy. You know, there's so much heat in the summer, it comes through the glass. You know, if we got thousands of people in here for a convention, we're just paying a fortune to keep this thing cool. So please, when you replace the glass, change the design of the building to make it more energy efficient. Well, the architects in question also happened to be experts in bird-friendly design, and they knew that they could actually do both things at once. They could create a new glass for this building that incorporates a sunshade. So some of the sunlight is blocked, but not all of it. And they could design that sunshade so that birds would see and avoid it. And in fact, this is what's happened. This building has reopened and its energy costs have dropped substantially. And at the same time, it's gone from being at the top of the list of New York City Audubon's buildings in New York that kill birds based on their monitoring data. They've reduced their collision rate by 95%. And this is even after adding a big green roof to the top, which you would think would attract more birds to the building. So this has been very successful, but you don't usually get to do this. Having to do this renovation cost millions of dollars. They only did it because they had to. Well, this is where legislation can be very helpful because when you have a requirement for bird-friendly design in the building code, before anybody creates a new building, they look at the building code to see what those requirements are. If there's a requirement for bird-friendly design, they'll see it right at the beginning. In 2008, the local Congressman Mike Quigley was able to pass bird-friendly legislation in Cook County, Illinois. This was the first time that this had happened in the United States. It was very forward-thinking. In 2009, Mike Quigley came to DC as a U.S. congressman representing Illinois. And in 2009, he introduced bird-friendly design legislation into the U.S. Congress. And nothing really happened. This was early. There hadn't been a lot of experience with this kind of legislation. It did not get a very enthusiastic response. But in the 10 years since then, many, many jurisdictions have adopted bird-friendly legislation. San Francisco was the leader. In 2011, they adopted standards for bird-safe buildings. What we found after the legislation went into play was that none of the things that people had feared, the reasons that there had been opposition to this legislation, came to pass. San Francisco has not been required to construct ugly buildings. It has not had to hire extra staff in order to administer this legislation. Buildings have not cost more money to construct. And a measure of that is the fact that many, many other communities in the northern part of California, and I probably don't have the whole list here, have adopted their own versions of this kind of legislation, in some cases making it stricter than San Francisco's, because they've seen that it works and that it's not that big a deal, that they can build the same kinds of buildings that they've been building all along, and that it's not going to cause an enormous problem. Minnesota adopted a statewide requirement in 2014, I believe. Other states are considering that. Maryland was very, very close to adopting statewide legislation when COVID hit. And so the Congress didn't finish their session. This has all sort of been building up over the last decade. And what's really exciting is what just happened in New York City. In January 2020, Local Law 15, which admittedly is really not a very exciting name, was signed into law in New York City. Local Law 15 requires all new construction and major retrofits to use bird-friendly design. This means all the boroughs of New York, from Staten Island to Manhattan. It means everything from a private home to a skyscraper. All of these will need to use bird-friendly design principles. 90% of the glass up to 75 feet will need to be bird-friendly on all these buildings. Now for homes, that means you can have a window with an insect screen, you can open the window, the screen needs to be on the outside, that's all you have to do. There are already bird-friendly buildings in Manhattan. This is the New York Times building, which was designed years ago to be bird-friendly. This is the Statue of Liberty Museum, which opened last year. It's got glass with a very subtle stripe that nobody notices, but it's bird-friendly. So New York was learning from other jurisdictions. It was learning from buildings that were being built within the city, and this law will go into effect in January of 2021. We've been working with the building department to help create guidelines so that architects and engineers will know what it means to comply with this legislation. The latest landmark, Congressman Mike Quigley's bill passed the House. He introduced that legislation every year since 2009. And every year there was a little more interest. He got another co-sponsor until finally in 2020, it was a bipartisan bill with a wide range of co-sponsors, and it passed Congress just a few weeks ago. What we need to do now is get the Senate to adopt the same legislation. And as we know, these days that's not a trivial ask, but this is not a particularly contentious requirement. We're trying to get people to save birds. So if you registered for this seminar, you'll be getting an email that'll include this action alert. We hope that you will take action to ask your senators to please support this bill. And you'll find more resources so that you can do this yourself on our website. We have resources that include different kinds of products that you can use. You can download this flyer, which lists home solutions and links so that you could find them. Our publication, Bird Friendly Building Design, which reviews the science behind the solutions. And I would be happy to take any questions that you might have.